The audio logs in the Interstellar Coalition's deep space archives usually sound like two things: static screaming or absolute silence. But File 77 Alpha was different. It didn't start with an explosion or a distress signal. It started with a sound that could make a seasoned space marine drop to his knees. It was the deep, bone-rattling roar of an alien apex predator. It was a sound designed by nature to freeze the blood in your veins. Then, the camera feed stabilized. The screen didn't show a mangled corpse or a destroyed base. Instead, it showed the dirty, sweat-streaked face of Cadet Skyler Pendleton. He was a 22-year-old kid from Columbus, Ohio, holding a portable military field camera. He casually wiped thick alien mud from the lens, panned the camera over to a terrifying, 6-ton monstrosity with razor-sharp teeth, and smirked. "Smile for the camera, buddy," Skyler whispered. "The folks back at the academy are never going to believe this. This is the classified true story of the deadliest final exam in military history." To understand how Skyler ended up on the worst planet in the galaxy, you have to understand the Interstellar Coalition Academy. Built on the freezing, airless surface of Earth's moon, the Academy had one simple goal: break the weak. The teachers didn't care about your feelings. The universe was full of hostile alien worlds, and humanity was fighting to survive. The curriculum was simple: learn to adapt, or die. Skyler Pendleton was never supposed to be there. He wasn't born into a family of legendary war heroes. He didn't have giant muscles or a killer instinct. In fact, he was an engineering dropout. His dad worked a boring office job as a math actuary in Ohio, and his mom was a mid-level manager at a Boeing factory. Skyler was scrawny, got motion sickness easily, and spent more time taking apart broken radios than practicing hand-to-hand combat. His quiet, analytical brain absolutely infuriated his drill instructors. "Cadet Pendleton. You look like a stiff breeze from Earth would snap you in half." The voice belonged to Commander Harrison, and it echoed off the titanium walls of the launch bay. Harrison was a terrifying veteran of the Sirius system campaigns. Half of his jaw had been blown off in battle and replaced with a gleaming silver prosthetic that made him look like a cyborg. Harrison stood over Skyler, staring down at him with pure disgust. "How do you expect to survive the gravity shear of a Class 9 planet when you can barely stand up straight in the gym?" Skyler adjusted the heavy straps of his standard-issue Lockheed Martin drop suit. The armor felt heavy and uncomfortable on his small frame. "I'll manage, sir," Skyler replied mildly. His voice was calm, even though his stomach was doing nervous flips. "Manage?" Harrison laughed, a harsh, metallic sound. "Today is the crucible, Pendleton. There is no managing. You either live, or you become a line of text on my paperwork." Today was the final evaluation. 40 cadets were being loaded into individual drop pods. Their destination was Gliese 832c, a planet the soldiers affectionately called the meat grinder. It was a tidally locked world, meaning one side always faced the burning hot sun. And the other side was trapped in dark, freezing night. The designated drop zone was the twilight line, a narrow strip of land between the hot and cold sides where the temperature was barely survivable. The exam rules were brutal: survive for 72 hours. The academy gave them almost nothing. No rifles, no heavy armor, and no radios. Every cadet was dropped with only a basic survival knife, 3 small water packs, a distress beacon, and a shoulder-mounted camera rig. The camera was hardwired to stream their progress directly back to the academy grading servers. The instructors wanted to watch every mistake they made. Skyler climbed inside drop pod 14. The heavy metal restraint harness slammed over his chest with a loud clank. Through the thick glass window of the pod, he could see the swirling, bruised purple clouds of Gliese 832c waiting below. "Drop in 3, 2, 1. Good hunting, cadets. Don't die on my watch," Commander Harrison's voice crackled over the comms. Then, the floor dropped out. The explosive bolts fired, releasing the pods from the massive space carrier. Skyler's stomach stayed behind in orbit as his pod plummeted toward the planet like a falling meteor. The atmospheric entry was a violently orchestrated car crash. The outside of the pod glowed a furious, blinding white as it rubbed against the thick atmosphere. The heat shielding groaned under the pressure. Skyler gripped the armrests, his teeth rattling so hard he thought they might break. Suddenly, a sickening jolt rocked the pod. The control screens flashed a bright, angry crimson. A warning siren began to wail inside the tiny cabin. A small piece of space debris had struck the pod's outer shell. Guidance system offline, a mechanical voice chimed. Skyler's hands flew over the manual control console. His engineering background immediately kicked in. He didn't panic, he looked at the wires and the code. But the thruster relays were totally fried. The pod wasn't slowing down, and worse, it was veering off course. He looked out the small window. He was moving away from the twilight line. He wasn't landing in the relatively safe zone. The pod was screaming directly toward the dark side of the planet, the midnight zone. It was a place of absolute darkness, cryogenic ice storms, and monstrous creatures that had evolved to hunt in the pitch black. The altimeter screamed as the ground rushed up to meet him. The safety rockets fired a fraction of a second too late. Boom! Drop Pod 14 slammed into the canopy of a colossal, alien forest. Massive, glass-like tree branches shattered against the metal hull, slowing the descent just enough to save Skyler's life. The pod tore through the alien jungle and hit the muddy ground with an earth-shattering crunch. It flipped twice, rolling violently, before burying its nose deep into the dark muck. Then, absolute silence descended. The capsule was dark, heavy, and suffocating. Skyler hung upside down in his harness, blood dripping from a fresh cut on his forehead. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting a sickly yellow glow over the smoking cabin. He groaned, unbuckling his harness, and dropped heavily onto the ceiling of the overturned pod. He tapped his wrist computer. Nothing. The screen was dead. The primary distress beacon was shattered into a dozen pieces. He was completely off the grid. He was hundreds of miles away from the training area. If he sat here and waited for a rescue team, he would rot before they ever found him. Skyler pushed against the jammed exit hatch. The hydraulic seals hissed in protest, and the heavy metal door finally fell open. Skyler stepped out into the freezing dark of the midnight zone, completely alone. The air outside the pod didn't taste like earth. It was thick, heavy, and tasted like metal and electricity. The temperature was dropping fast, and every breath Skyler took felt like inhaling needles. He looked around, but there was no sun to help him see. This was the midnight zone, a place of permanent night. The only light came from the jungle itself. Giant, twisted tree trunks covered in strange, glowing moss towered over him. The moss pulsed with faint, ghostly blues and sickly greens, casting long, creepy shadows across the muddy ground. It felt like standing inside a giant, haunted aquarium. Skyler reached back into the smoking wreckage of Drop Pod 14 and dragged out his survival pack. He checked his gear. He had a standard combat knife, a thin thermal blanket, 3 small hydration packs, a magnesium fire starter, and the camera rig mounted on his shoulder armor. The camera's red recording light blinked steadily. It was saving everything to a local hard drive, but because his long-range radio was smashed, nobody back at the academy could see him. A sudden wave of loneliness washed over him. He was 22 years old, miles away from his drop zone, and completely alone on a Deathworld. According to the Academy's statistics, a cadet stranded in the wild without a rifle had a survival time of less than 12 hours. Skyler looked directly into the camera lens. "My name is Cadet Skyler Pendleton," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "Current location unknown. Gliese 832C, dark side. My pod suffered a catastrophic guidance failure." If anyone finds this recording, please tell my parents in Columbus that I didn't die screaming. Or at least, I tried not to. He took a deep, freezing breath. I'm going to document everything. Maybe the biology department can use the footage of whatever ends up eating me. Skyler knew he couldn't stay near the crash site. The impact had been incredibly loud, and the smell of burnt metal and human blood was like a dinner bell for local predators. He needed to find shelter, and he needed to find it now. He hiked through the treacherous jungle for 2 grueling hours. The mud was thick and black, sucking at his heavy boots like hungry mouths. Every shadow seemed to move. The noises of the forest were a constant nightmare. He heard deep, rhythmic clicks that vibrated in his chest, low growls from the bushes, and sudden, high-pitched shrieks that cut off abruptly when a creature was caught by something bigger. Finally, he found something useful. A massive, petrified tree had fallen over, and its giant, tangled root system formed a shallow cave. It was perfect. The roots protected him from the back and the sides, leaving only one narrow opening to guard. Skyler gathered a pile of brittle, glowing sticks and dry sap from the nearby trees. He knelt in the dirt, took out his magnesium starter, and scraped his knife against it. Sparks flew into the pile, catching the dry sap. A small, orange fire crackled to life. The warmth felt incredible, but the psychological comfort was even better. It pushed back the terrifying darkness. He set his camera on a nearby rock, framing himself against the fire. Entry 2, he whispered. Establishing a perimeter. The atmosphere here is hyperoxygenated, so the fire burns hot and fast. I have to be careful. The temperature outside is dropping rapidly. I estimate it's already minus 20 degrees Celsius. But Skyler didn't plan on just sitting there like a sitting duck. He wasn't a master fighter, but he was a damn good engineer. He opened his pack and pulled out the ruined internal communication box he had ripped from the pod before leaving. Using his survival knife like a screwdriver, he carefully pulled apart the casing. His small fingers worked with perfect precision, stripping copper wiring and extracting the pod's heavy-duty microcapacitors. These little batteries were designed to hold a massive electrical charge. For the next hour, he built a trap. He ran the thin copper wire across the entrance of his root cave, just a few inches off the ground, creating a classic tripwire. Then, he wired the ends directly into the charged capacitors. He looked at the camera and smiled faintly, wiping a smudge of black dirt from his cheek. I just built a makeshift electrostatic perimeter alarm. If anything steps on that wire, the capacitors will discharge all their energy at once. It will create a loud pop and a blinding flash of electricity. It's not strong enough to kill a big monster, but it should scare the hell out of them. Human ingenuity, right? Wrapping himself tightly in his thin thermal blanket, Skyler sat at the back of the cave. He clutched the grip of his survival knife so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. He just sat in the dark, listening to the Deathworld breathe outside. Around 4 in the morning, the jungle went dead silent. The ambient chirping, the clicking, and the distant growls all vanished in an instant. The sudden quiet was terrifying. The hairs on Skyler's arms stood straight up. His instincts screamed at him that something was wrong. Snap! A massive branch broke in the distance. Then came a low, rhythmic thudding sound. The footsteps were so heavy that loose dirt began to shake down from the roof of his cave. Whatever was walking out there wasn't trying to hide. It didn't need to. It walked like a king, knowing that nothing in this forest could challenge it. It was the apex predator. Skyler held his breath, his eyes wide as he stared into the pitch-black opening of his shelter. He slowly reached up and tapped the side of his camera, making sure the low-light sensors were running. If this was the end, he was going to get it on tape. The shadow moved closer. Suddenly, the copper tripwire snapped with a sharp twang. Instantly, the rigged capacitors detonated. Crack! A brilliant, blinding flash of blue-white electricity exploded in the darkness. The intense light illuminated a massive shape outside the cave, followed immediately by an unearthly, deafening roar of pure shock and pain. The sound wave of the roar was so powerful it physically blew into the cave, instantly suffocating Skyler's small campfire and plunging him right back into total, absolute blackness. Skyler scrambled backward, pressing his spine hard against the petrified roots, waiting for the giant claws to reach in and tear him apart. The campfire was dead, and the darkness was total. Skyler squeezed his eyes shut, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The echo of that massive roar still shook the air inside the root cave. He held his small survival knife out in front of him, his hands trembling violently. He waited for the giant claws. He waited for the teeth. He waited for the end. But the attack never came. Instead, the terrifying roar quickly shifted into a series of ragged, wet gasps. Heavy thuds shook the muddy ground outside, followed by the sound of an immense weight collapsing into the swampy muck. Then, a low, echoing whimper cut through the dark forest. It was a sound of pure agony. Skyler stayed frozen for what felt like hours. He looked down at his tactical wrist computer. The small digital timer told him only 20 minutes had passed, but every second felt like a day. The heavy, painful breathing outside the cave didn't stop. It didn't sound like a monster waiting to ambush him. It sounded like something dying. Curiosity, that dangerous human trait, began to take over his fear. Skyler knew he was statistically dead anyway. If he stayed in the cave, he would freeze. If he ran, something else would catch him. Slowly, agonizingly, Skyler crawled forward toward the entrance of his shelter. He reached up to his shoulder, detached the ocular camera rig, and held it out in front of him like a shield. He clicked a button on the side, switching the camera's powerful floodlight to a dim red hue. Red light was less likely to provoke a wild animal. The thin red beam cut through the thick mist outside. 10 yards away, lying in the black mud, was the beast. It was absolutely breathtaking. It looked like a nightmarish combination of a giant prehistoric wolf and a heavily armored dinosaur. The creature was easily 15 feet long from its blunt, crocodilian snout to the tip of its heavy, spiked tail. Thick, carbon-black scales covered its muscular back, while its underbelly was a softer, leathery gray. But what caught Skyler's attention were the bioluminescent stripes running down its sides. They were flashing an erratic, frantic crimson color. The beast was lying on its side, its massive legs twitching weakly. As Skyler's red light swept over the creature's body, he finally realized why it hadn't killed him. It was already in a fight for its life, and it was losing. Clinging to the beast's thick neck and leathery underbelly were dozens of disgusting, fist-sized alien parasites. They looked like giant, translucent leeches. Their pale bodies pulsed as they visibly drained the massive predator's bright purple blood. The beast pawed weakly at its own neck with a massive, scythe-like claw, but it was too exhausted and drained to pull them off. Suddenly, the monster turned its massive head. It looked directly at Skyler. Its eyes were giant pools of liquid gold, the pupils dilated with absolute agony. In that quiet moment, Skyler didn't see a terrifying alien apex predator. He didn't see a monster that could crush a dropship. He just saw an animal in pain. It was the exact same look his childhood golden retriever, Buster, had given him back in Ohio when his leg got caught in a wire fence. "You watching this, Academy?" Skyler whispered softly to the camera in his hand. "This is the big bad monster of the Midnight Zone. It's being eaten alive by oversized ticks." The standard military protocol taught by Commander Harrison was crystal clear: never engage with local wildlife unless it is to kill or consume. Never show empathy. Empathy on a Deathworld gets you killed. Skyler looked at the dying beast. He looked at his small survival knife. Then, he looked down at the emergency magnesium flare resting in his tactical belt. "To hell with protocol," Skyler muttered. He set the camera down securely on a tree stump, angling the lens to capture the entire clearing. He grabbed the emergency flare from his belt and struck the igniter. A searing, brilliant red magnesium light exploded into the dark clearing, bathing everything in intense heat. The sudden flash and temperature change caused the pale parasites to writhe and twist in disgust. Skyler took a step forward. The giant beast instantly rumbled a deep, vibrating warning growl in its chest, bearing teeth the size of combat knives. "Easy," Skyler said, keeping his voice incredibly steady and calm, projecting a confidence he absolutely did not feel inside. "Easy, big guy. I'm not here to hurt you. Let me help." He didn't know if the alien creature understood his English words, but the tone of his voice worked. The beast's sheer exhaustion won over its aggression. Its heavy head dropped back weakly into the black mud. Skyler approached the massive neck. Up close, the smell was overwhelming, a mix of animal musk, sharp ozone, and copper-flavored blood. He brought the burning, hot flare close to one of the translucent parasites. The intense heat was too much for the leech. It shrieked a high, reedy sound, detached its grip, and dropped into the mud to scurry away. Before it could escape, Skyler brought the heavy heel of his combat boot down, crushing it with a sickening pop. One down, Skyler breathed, wiping sweat from his eyes. He spent the next hour working meticulously in the freezing dark. He used the hot flare to burn the parasites, forcing them to release their grip from the leathery hide. For the leeches that were dug too deep into the scales, he used his sharp survival knife, carefully slicing them open and peeling their mandibles out of the beast's flesh. Through the entire process, the 6-ton apex predator remained remarkably still. It flinched and groaned when the knife dug too close to its skin, but it never snapped its jaws at him. It was as if the creature recognized that this strange, hairless bipedal creature was performing a life-saving service. By the time Skyler crushed the final parasite, he was completely covered in purple alien blood and exhausted to his very bones. His emergency flare sputtered twice and died, plunging them right back into the dim, ghostly blue glow of the forest moss. Skyler collapsed backward against a tree trunk, gasping for air. He slid down until he was sitting flat in the mud. He looked over at the giant beast. The erratic crimson flashing of its bioluminescent stripes had stopped. The lines were now pulsing a steady, calm, peaceful blue. The beast slowly raised its massive head. It looked at Skyler with its golden eyes, unblinking. Then, it slowly hauled its 6-ton bulk up onto its 4 muscular legs, towering completely over the tiny human. Skyler held his breath, his body freezing. "This is it," he thought. "I saved it, and now it's going to eat me for dessert." The giant beast stood at its full height, towering over Skyler like an armored tank. Its golden eyes stared down at the tiny human sitting in the mud. Skyler closed his eyes, bracing for the worst. But instead of sharp teeth, he felt a massive, hot snout press hard against his chest. The rough nudge completely knocked the wind out of him, sending him sprawling backward. The beast didn't bite. Instead, it slowly turned around and curled its massive, 15-foot body into a circle right around the tree trunk Skyler was leaning against. It completely trapped the human inside a protective wall of heavy, armored scales. The monster let out a deep, rumbling sigh that vibrated straight through Skyler's spine, rested its massive head on its giant paws, and closed its eyes. Skyler sat there, pinned between the tree and 6 tons of lethal alien muscle. A wild, disbelieving grin spread across his exhausted face. He reached over, grabbed his camera from the stump, and turned the lens toward himself. "Update log," Skyler whispered. "I think I just adopted a dog. I'm going to call him Barnaby." When Skyler woke up, he heard a sound like a heavy diesel engine idling right against his back. He opened his eyes, momentarily blinded by the absolute darkness before his vision adjusted to the dim, glowing moss of the forest. The heavy, rhythmic vibration vibrating through his suit was Barnaby. The apex predator was fast asleep, emitting a low, resonant purr that felt like a mini earthquake. Skyler checked his tactical wrist computer. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, standard Earth time. The external temperature sensor read -35 degrees Celsius. If Barnaby hadn't coiled around him, trapping their combined body heat inside a biological sleeping bag, Skyler would have frozen to death hours ago. He unclipped the camera rig from his shoulder armor, checking the power levels. The battery was at 70%. He clicked the recording light. Day 2, hour 14, Skyler whispered into the lens, his breath forming thick white clouds in the freezing air. I survived the night. Mostly because my new roommate is a living space heater. He panned the camera to capture Barnaby's massive, armored snout resting peacefully on paws the size of garbage can lids. The beast's bioluminescent stripes pulsed a tranquil, slow azure blue. I don't think the Academy Biology Department is going to believe this footage, Skyler muttered. The apex predator of Gliese 832C, the monster they told us would rip a transport ship in half, is currently using my backpack as a pillow. Slowly and carefully. Skyler crawled out from inside the beast's coils. Barnaby cracked one massive golden eye open, let out a loud huff of air that smelled like electricity, and lazily closed it again. Skyler took inventory of his remaining supplies. He had half a liter of water left in his tactical hydration bladder, 0 food rations, his survival knife, and a standard medical trauma kit. He was incredibly thirsty, and his stomach was loudly protesting the lack of food. All right, Barnaby, Skyler said, gently patting the beast's thick, leathery side. The scales felt as hard and cold as military body armor. Time to get up. If I don't find water, I'm going to dehydrate before anything else gets the chance to eat me. Barnaby stood up immediately, shaking his massive frame like a wet dog. The sudden motion sent a shower of dried mud and crushed alien leaves flying into the bushes. The beast sniffed the freezing air, its nostrils flaring. Then, it looked down at Skyler, gave a short, commanding bark, and began to trot into the dense, black jungle. Skyler jogged quickly to keep up with the creature's massive strides. Following the giant alien monster seems like a solid survival strategy, he muttered to his camera. For 3 long hours, they hiked through the treacherous midnight zone. The terrain was brutal, filled with jagged, crystal rock formations and deep crevices overflowing with a toxic-looking blue mist. Barnaby navigated the dangerous path with an eerie, silent grace that completely contrasted his massive size. Twice, the beast stopped abruptly, its glowing stripes instantly flashing a warning yellow. Both times, Skyler froze in his tracks. He watched as Barnaby stared down unseen horrors hiding in the deep brush, creatures with far too many eyes and twitching limbs that quickly scurried away, terrified of the Alpha's presence. Barnaby was effectively acting as Skyler's VIP escort through hell. Around noon, a welcome sound cut through the dark forest, the rush of moving water. Barnaby led him to a fast-moving, subterranean river bursting through a canyon of giant roots. The water looked pitch black, but it was flowing rapidly. Skyler quickly pulled out his military filtration straw, praying it could handle foreign alien microbes, and began to drink greedily from the edge. As Skyler rehydrated, Barnaby waded straight into the freezing, dark river. The beast stood perfectly still, looking like a dark statue against the rushing current. Suddenly, his head snapped down into the water with the lightning speed of a striking viper. When he lifted his snout, an eel-like creature easily 6 feet long was thrashing violently in his jaws. With a sickening crunch, Barnaby snapped the creature in half, swallowing the larger piece whole. He then waded back to the riverbank and dropped the remaining, bloody half of the alien eel right at Skyler's feet. Barnaby sat back on his hind legs, watching the human expectantly. Skyler looked at the raw, twitching alien meat. He looked at the camera, then looked back at Barnaby. Sushi, Skyler deadpanned. My favorite. Using his magnesium starter and some dry river moss, Skyler managed to get a small fire going. He skewered the eel meat on a sharp branch and roasted it until it was completely charred black on the outside. It tasted awful, like battery acid and burnt tires, but it was pure protein, and his body desperately needed it. Entry 4, Skyler said to the camera, chewing the tough meat mechanically. Codependence established. He hunts, I cook. I think we're actually going to make it through. Skyler stopped talking instantly. He held up a hand, silencing his own narration. Clank. The noise was faint, but it was absolutely unmistakable. It wasn't the sound of a wild animal, and it wasn't the shifting of rocks. It was the high-pitched, mechanical whine of a servo motor. It was artificial. It was high-tech. Barnaby heard it too. The beast's glowing stripes immediately flared an aggressive, violent crimson red. A deep, guttural growl began to build in the center of his chest. Skyler grabbed his camera and gripped his knife tightly. That's not Academy drop pod telemetry, he whispered into the lens, his eyes narrowing in the dark. That sounds like a military drone. Skyler and Barnaby moved silently up the rocky ridge, following the low, mechanical hum. Skyler stayed low to the ground, using Barnaby's massive, armored body as moving cover. As they crested the hill and peered down into a massive, sunken valley, Skyler's breath hitched. Camera, are you getting this? Skyler whispered, adjusting the focal lens of his shoulder rig to maximum zoom. In the clearing below, illuminated by massive industrial floodlights, was a sprawling military encampment. But it wasn't an Interstellar Coalition rescue team. There were two heavily modified, matte black dropships that looked suspiciously like militarized stealth aircraft. All their official military markings had been completely stripped and painted over. Surrounding the ships were portable, high-voltage containment fences humming with deadly electrical energy. Inside those fences were massive, reinforced steel cages built by heavy industrial machinery, the yellow factory paint still visible under layers of thick alien mud. Walking around the perimeter were men and women dressed in heavy, unmarked tactical armor. They weren't carrying standard trainee gear. They were carrying advanced battle rifles modified with underbarrel neurostunners. Mercenaries, Skyler breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Private military contractors. But it was what was inside the heavy steel cages that made Skyler's blood run cold, and caused Barnaby to let out a muffled, agonizing whine. There were 3 other beasts of Barnaby's species locked inside. They were battered, bloody, and heavily secured with thick titanium chains. One of them, a smaller female, was lying completely motionless on the freezing ground. Her bioluminescent stripes were barely emitting a faint, dying gray glow. They aren't just surviving here, Skyler recorded, a sudden, unfamiliar fury washing over him. They're poaching. Someone is paying private contractors to illegally harvest the apex predators of Gliese 832C. Skyler zoomed the camera in closer on a large cargo crate being loaded into the nearest dropship. It was stenciled with a prominent logo, Apex Biogenetics. Apex Biogenetics was a massive pharmaceutical and weapons manufacturer back on Earth. The Coalition High Command used Gliese 832C as a strictly restricted military training ground. Corporate entities were completely forbidden from operating here by interstellar law. This was a highly illegal, off-the-books corporate harvesting run. They were likely extracting the beast's unique bioluminescent glands or their highly regenerative fluids to create black market combat drugs. Skyler knew the stakes instantly. If these mercenaries spotted a cadet with a live recording feed to the Academy, they would shoot him on sight. He was a loose end. The smartest thing to do, the only logical survival strategy, was to retreat into the jungle, find a deep cave, and hide out for the remaining 48 hours until standard cadet extraction. He looked down at Barnaby. The giant beast was trembling, its golden eyes locked onto the cages. Its massive claws were digging deep trenches into the rocky soil, leaving marks of pure frustration. It was looking at its own family. Skyler thought about his drill instructor's harsh words, "Empathy gets you killed, Pendleton." "Hey, Barnaby," Skyler whispered softly. He turned off the camera's active light to ensure they stayed completely hidden in the brush. He reached out and placed a gentle hand on the beast's trembling snout. Barnaby looked down at him, his golden eyes filled with desperate intelligence. "You saved my life last night," Skyler whispered. "I guess I owe you one." Skyler wasn't a real soldier. He couldn't shoot a rifle with perfect accuracy, and he certainly couldn't take on 20 heavily armed mercenaries in a head-on gunfight. But he was an engineer. And engineers knew exactly how things were put together, which meant they knew exactly how to break them. He opened his tactical pack and dumped the contents silently into the dirt. He had a few feet of leftover copper wire, his filtration straw, the trauma kit, the magnesium starter, and his camera rig. He also still had the heavy-duty microcapacitors he had stripped from his crashed drop pod the night before. He looked back down at the encampment. The portable generators powering the high-voltage fences and the floodlights were positioned right near the dark tree line, humming loudly. The mercenaries were relying entirely on the sheer danger of the midnight zone to keep them safe from the outside. All their weapons and guards were pointed inward, watching the cages. They never expected an attack from the jungle. "All right, buddy, here's the plan," Skyler said, his hands working furiously with his survival knife. He stripped the insulation off the copper wire and connected it directly to the highly charged microcapacitors. "I'm going to create a diversion. A big one. When the lights go out and the electrical fence drops, you do what you do best." Barnaby let out a low, rumbling huff of air, as if completely understanding the assignment. Skyler strapped the camera back onto his shoulder armor. The red recording light blinked steadily through the smoke and mist. "Let's make a documentary," Skyler muttered, and slipped away into the dark. Skyler crawled on his stomach through the freezing, black underbrush. It took him 20 agonizing minutes to get close to the noisy portable diesel generator. 2 mercenary guards were standing just 40 feet away, smoking cigarettes and complaining about the bitter cold in thick Texas accents. "I'm telling you, Cole, this planet is cursed," one of them muttered, stamping his boots. "As soon as we load the last harvest, I'm taking my payout and buying a house on a beach." "Just keep your eyes on those cages, Garrett," the other guard replied, holding his battle rifle tightly. "Those monsters can snap a titanium chain if they get enough leverage." Skyler reached the back of the humming generator. He didn't have explosives to blow it up, but as an engineer, he didn't need them. He just needed to short-circuit the main power lines. He took his bundle of stripped copper wire, which was connected to the highly charged pod capacitors, and jammed it directly into the generator's spinning cooling fan housing. He didn't wait to see what happened. He turned around and sprinted back into the dark jungle as fast as his legs could carry him. 3 seconds later, the copper wire tangled in the high-speed turbine. It ripped the capacitors right into the main power relay. Boom! A blinding shower of blue electrical sparks erupted from the machine, followed by a loud mechanical screech. In an instant, the massive industrial floodlights died. The hum of the high-voltage fences vanished into complete silence. The entire mercenary encampment was instantly plunged into pitch-black darkness. "What the hell was that?" Garrett yelled in the dark. "The generator blew. Get your night vision goggles on, now," Cole shouted into his radio. But before the mercenaries could activate their tactical optics, a sound ripped through the clearing that froze the blood in their veins. It was a roar so loud and primal that it physically shook the trees. Out of the darkness, a 6-ton shadow moving at 40 miles per hour slammed directly into the side of the nearest stealth dropship. The immense impact crumpled the armored metal fuselage like a cheap tin can. Barnaby had entered the fight. The beast's bioluminescent stripes were blazing a terrifying, blinding crimson red. The strobing red light instantly ruined the mercenaries' night vision goggles, blinding them. Barnaby didn't stop. He pivoted his heavy body, using his spiked tail like a massive wrecking ball. The tail swept across the dirt, taking out 3 guards at once and sending them flying into the mud. Contact. Heavy contact, gunfire erupted. The loud crack of battle rifles echoed through the valley. The bright muzzle flashes illuminated Barnaby's armored scales as the bullet sparked and deflected uselessly off his thick hide. Skyler used the chaotic distraction. He darted out of the tree line, sprinting through the churning mud straight toward the steel cages. The mercenaries were completely focused on the rampaging alpha monster tearing their camp apart, so nobody saw the scrawny cadet running past. Skyler reached the first cage. The electronic lock on the heavy steel door had died when the generator shut down. He grabbed the heavy manual latch, throwing his entire body weight against it. The massive steel door swung open with a loud groan. Inside, a huge, scarred male beast glared down at Skyler. It saw a human, the same species that had chained it up and tortured it. The beast bared its massive fangs, a low warning growl rumbling in its throat. Skyler didn't flinch. He didn't run. Instead, he pointed directly out toward the center of the camp, where Barnaby was currently ripping a mounted gun turret off a transport vehicle with his bare teeth. Go! Skyler screamed over the deafening gunfire. Go help your friend. The scarred beast looked at Barnaby, then looked back down at the tiny human. It didn't hesitate. With a roar that vibrated the fillings in Skyler's teeth, the newly freed apex predator charged out of the cage and lunged straight into the fight. Skyler scrambled toward the second cage, adrenaline flooding his veins. He glanced down at his shoulder rig, the red recording light blinking steadily through the thick smoke and mud. Academy Command, Skyler yelled into the camera over the sound of tearing metal and screaming mercenaries. If you're watching this live stream on a delay, I think I'm going to need extra credit for this final exam. Leaving the monsters to decimate the mercenary defense line. Skyler sprinted toward the only structure left intact, the main tactical command tent. He needed answers. He ripped open the flap of the insulated tent. Inside, a portable space heater was humming quietly in the corner. In the center of the room sat a rugged, military-grade tactical laptop. It was still booted up, running off an independent battery supply. Skyler set his camera down on a crate, framing both himself and the computer screen. He pulled up a chair and his fingers flew across the keyboard. He might be a terrible frontline soldier, but data systems were his native language. He easily bypassed the mercenary security and opened a folder labeled Project Aspenglow, Harvest Manifest. As his eyes scanned the digital documents, his stomach dropped into a cold, bottomless pit. Camera, you're getting this, right? Skyler said, his voice deadly quiet and serious. These are shipping manifests. They are harvesting the beast's spinal fluid to synthesize a black market combat drug for a megacorporation on Earth. He clicked on the next folder, titled Acquisition Protocols. To find the beasts, they need bait, Skyler read aloud from the screen, his eyes widening in pure horror. The predators are highly intelligent and avoid mechanical patrols. But they are fiercely territorial. They will always attack foreign biological intrusions. Skyler scrolled down further, and a list of names appeared on the screen. Cadet Jenkins, R. Cadet Ollie, T. Cadet Pendleton, S. Skyler stopped breathing. It was the exact roster for his current drop class. Next to each name were live GPS coordinates broadcasting their real-time locations. They're tracking us, Skyler whispered, a profound sense of betrayal washing over him. The drop pod malfunction, it wasn't an accident. It was a remote override. They intentionally drop a handful of cadets outside the safe zone every single cycle. The panic, our blood, our distress beacons, we aren't students taking an exam. We are the dinner bell. We are live bait used to draw the alphas out of the deep brush so the mercenaries can ambush them. He clicked the final document. It was a digital payment ledger routed through a secret bank account. The authorizing signature on the coalition military side, the man signing off on the acceptable training fatalities, and selling out his own students to a corporate meat grinder, stared back at him in Stark black pixels. Commander Elias Harrison. Skyler slumped back in the chair, a cold, searing anger replacing his fear. His drill instructor, the man who constantly lectured them about honor and how empathy would get them killed, was the one murdering them for a corporate payout. They aren't coming to rescue me, Skyler realized, looking directly into the camera lens. Standard extraction is in 48 hours. But Harrison will just send a cleanup crew to make sure the bait didn't survive to tell the tale. Skyler didn't have time to process the betrayal. He pulled a heavy-duty, encrypted flash drive from his tactical vest and jammed it into the mercenary laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard, aggressively copying every single file, the harvest manifests, the live telemetry tracking logs, and Commander Harrison's digital signatures. Once the progress bar hit 100%, he yanked the drive out and secured it in a waterproof pouch inside his armored suit. He picked up his camera rig, looking directly into the lens. His voice was no longer trembling. It was cold and full of anger. Academy Command, if any honest officer is receiving this data packet on a delay, hear me now. Commander Harrison is compromised. He is trading cadet lives for corporate payouts. I have the proof, but my pod's transmitter is destroyed. I can't broadcast this from the mud. He quickly pulled up a digital map of the planet on the laptop screen. About 60 miles north is Mount Erebus. At the summit sits an old, abandoned orbital relay tower left behind by the first survey teams. If I can patch my suit's computer into that giant dish, I can broadcast this data directly to the Coalition High Command mainframe on Earth, bypassing Harrison entirely. I am heading for the Erebus relay. I'm going to blow this operation wide open. Skyler sprinted out of the command tent, and the scene outside was absolute chaos. The mercenaries were panicking. Fall back. Form a defensive line by the second ship, a mercenary captain screamed over the noise. Bring up the heavy launcher. Burn that big bastard down. A mercenary hoisted a shoulder-mounted plasma rocket launcher, aiming the bright green targeting laser directly at Barnaby's chest. Barnaby was fast, but he couldn't dodge a heavy anti-tank missile. No. Skyler gasped. He looked around frantically and spotted a piece of heavy machinery idling near the cages, a massive, 10-ton industrial wheel loader with a giant steel bucket on the front. Painted bright construction yellow. Skyler bolted for the machine. He swung up the side ladder, ripped open the heavy door, and jumped into the cab. Mercenaries were usually lazy in secure zones, the keys were sitting right in the ignition. Skyler slammed his foot on the accelerator and pushed the hydraulic levers forward. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, belching thick black smoke. The mercenary's finger tightened on the rocket launcher's trigger. "Hey, assholes!" Skyler screamed from the cab. He drove the massive yellow bulldozer straight into the equipment crates right next to the mercenaries. The 10-ton machine smashed into the metal structures with an earth-shattering crunch. The heavy impact knocked the rocket specialist completely off his feet. The plasma missile fired wildly into the air, streaking harmlessly into the sky and vaporizing the upper canopy of the forest. Skyler threw the bulldozer into reverse, spinning the steering wheel hard. He raised the giant steel bucket, placing the massive bulk of the vehicle squarely between the remaining guards and the cages, acting as a human shield encased in industrial steel. Bullets rained against the loader's reinforced glass, peppering the metal chassis like hail. Skyler ducked beneath the dashboard as glass rained down on his back. Seeing Skyler draw all the heavy gunfire, Barnaby let out a roar of absolute fury. His bioluminescent stripes flared into a blinding, strobing crimson. He and the other freed male beast charged the remaining defensive line from two different sides. It was a perfectly executed pincer movement. The monsters possessed a terrifying, almost human tactical intelligence. The mercenary line completely shattered. Pure panic set in. Abort the mission. Get on the ship, the captain screamed, abandoning his wounded men and sprinting up the ramp of the surviving stealth dropship. The aircraft violently lifted off the ground, its engines screaming as it disappeared into the dark, purple sky of the midnight zone, leaving the ruined camp behind. Silence finally descended on the valley, broken only by the crackle of localized fires. Skyler climbed down from the shattered cab of the bulldozer, his legs shaking violently from the adrenaline rush. Barnaby trotted over to him, covered in minor cuts, but completely unfazed. He bumped his massive snout against Skyler's chest, checking on his human friend. "I'm okay, buddy." "I'm okay," Skyler said, leaning his tired body against the beast's warm, hard scales. Skyler ran over to the third cage and used a captured magnetic security key to release the heavy titanium collars from the wounded female beast. Barnaby and the scarred male immediately moved into the cage, nuzzling her flank and communicating in low, peaceful vibrations. They were a pack. A family. "Hey, Barnaby," Skyler called out softly, walking up to the giant predator. "I have to take a walk. A long one. Up that mountain. There are going to be a lot of guys with guns trying to stop me." Barnaby looked at Skyler, then turned his head to the other two beasts. He let out a sharp, commanding bark. The scarred male nodded his heavy head, gently guiding the weak female into the deep, safe shadows of the jungle. They were escaping. Then, Barnaby turned back to Skyler. He didn't run away. Instead, the 6-ton monster lowered his massive shoulder into the mud, dipping his head and inviting the human to climb onto his back. Skyler stared in absolute disbelief. "You want to give me a ride?" Barnaby huffed impatiently, blowing a huge cloud of steam into the freezing air. Skyler smiled, a grim, determined expression. He climbed up the thick scales, straddling the beast's broad back and gripping the heavy ridge spikes like saddle horns. He clipped his camera securely to his shoulder armor. "Entry 6, Skyler said proudly over the humming wind. "New objective, the Erebus relay. Mode of transport, 6 tons of highly ticked-off apex predator. Harrison, if you're watching this. You messed with the wrong cadet." Barnaby roared, a sound that echoed for miles across the dark canopy, challenging anything foolish enough to stand in their way. With a powerful lunge, the beast carried the human forward, beginning the long, brutal march toward the frozen summit of the mountain. The trek up Mount Erebus was a vertical nightmare. As they climbed higher, leaving the glowing forest of the midnight zone behind, the temperature plummeted to a deadly -40 degrees Celsius. The wind shrieked like a jet engine, carrying sharp shards of ice that scratched against Skyler's suit. If he hadn't been pressed directly against Barnaby's massively warm, radiating body, his blood would have frozen solid hours ago. "Camera battery at 20%, Skyler rasped, his lips cracked and bleeding. He kept the lens angled over Barnaby's spiked shoulder. "Elevation is roughly 14,000 feet. The Erebus relay is just over the next ridge, but we've got company." Cutting through the eternal darkness below them were the sharp beams of high-powered searchlights. Commander Harrison had realized his secret files were copied. He wasn't sending standard mercenaries anymore, he had deployed his own elite Black Ops retrieval team. They were heavily armed and explicitly ordered to leave no survivors. Behind them, Skyler could hear the mechanical clatter of autonomous combat hounds leading the pack. "They're tracking my suit's thermal signature," Skyler muttered, looking down at his wrist computer. "Barnaby, we need to break their line of sight, or they're going to paint us for an orbital strike." Barnaby let out a low growl, his golden eyes scanning the treacherous cliff face. The beast possessed an incredible awareness of the mountain. He moved toward a massive overhang of unstable glacial ice that hung perilously over the narrow path the soldiers had to use. Skyler instantly saw what the beast was planning. "You want to drop the roof on them? I can help with that." Skyler dismounted quickly. He pulled his final weapon from his tactical pouch, a standard-issue military fragmentation grenade. He wedged it deep into a natural crack in the frozen ice directly above the mountain pass. He tied the grenade's pin to a length of his leftover copper wire, running the line back behind a heavy rock where Barnaby was waiting. "Come on, you bastards," Skyler breathed, gripping the wire. Minutes later, a dozen elite operatives marched into the narrow pass, their weapons raised. Skyler didn't wait. He pulled the wire hard. The grenade detonated deep inside the ice fault with a muffled thump. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the mountain groaned. A massive web of fissures shot through the ice overhang. With a sound like a thunderclap, 1,000 tons of ancient ice and rock sheared off the cliff face. Avalanche! "Look out!" a soldier screamed, but it was too late. The massive wall of ice slammed into the pass. The combat hounds were instantly crushed, and half the squad was swept over the edge into the abyss. Skyler didn't wait to watch the aftermath. He vaulted back onto Barnaby's back. "Go, buddy, go." Barnaby lunged upward, his heavy claws finding purchase on the sheer rock, carrying them over the final crest and onto the frozen summit of Mount Erebus. Rising from the snowy plateau was the Erebus Relay, a brutalist monolith of rusting titanium and giant parabolic communication dishes. Skyler practically slid off Barnaby's shoulder, his legs giving out as his boots hit the ice. His body was completely exhausted. He crawled the last 20 feet to the base of the tower. Barnaby followed slowly, limping slightly, and panting heavy clouds of steam. His bioluminescent stripes were a dim indigo, a sign of severe physical fatigue. "Almost there, buddy," Skyler rasped. He dragged himself to the external access terminal of the tower. The screen was shattered and frozen under 2 inches of ice. Skyler brought the heavy steel handle of his survival knife down on the panel, shattering the frozen casing. He ripped the panel away, exposing the fiber optic trunk lines and analog relays underneath. His hands were shaking violently from the freezing cold. He clamped the knife blade in his teeth, using his fingers to strip the insulation off the primary data lines. He pulled the encrypted flash drive from his vest, the drive containing Harrison's illegal poaching logs. The relay was powered down, so Skyler needed to trick the system. He grabbed the heavy power cable connecting his drop suit to its lithium-ion battery, sliced the cord, and jammed the live wires directly into the relay board. Sparks showered over his visor, but a low hum vibrated through the floor. The old tower was waking up. A small green screen flickered to life, local uplink established. Waiting for handshake. Skyler jammed the flash drive into the port and twisted the spliced data wires together. Handshake accepted. Commencing data burst. A progress bar appeared, 1%. 4%. 9%. "Come on," Skyler prayed. "Come on." Suddenly, the howling wind was overwhelmed by a deafening, rhythmic thudding. Rising over the cliff face was a nightmare, a heavily modified military gunship, painted matte black. A multi-barrel rotary cannon spooled up under its cockpit with a high-pitched whine. A pair of ruby-red targeting lasers cut through the snow, painting a dot directly on the terminal. "Barnaby, get down!" Skyler screamed, throwing his body over the fragile wires to protect the upload. The rotary cannon opened fire. It didn't sound like a gun, it sounded like the fabric of reality tearing in half. Heavy armor-piercing rounds slammed into the tower, ripping huge chunks of titanium from the structure. The deafening roar of the impacts shook the very foundation of the mountain. Skyler squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for a bullet to turn him into dust. But the gunfire suddenly ceased, replaced by a deep guttural roar that dwarfed the sound of the aircraft. Barnaby had not taken cover. The apex predator was standing tall in the center of the plateau, his stripes blazing a blinding, furious crimson red. He dug his massive front claws into the ice, and with a violent heave of his neck, he ripped a 2-ton boulder of frozen rock right out of the ground. Using his heavy tail as a counterweight, Barnaby spun and hurled the massive boulder directly at the gunship. The pilot banked hard, but the boulder clipped the aircraft's left side, completely shearing off its rocket pod. The gunship lurched violently, alarms blaring. "Kill that monster," the pilot shouted over the open radio channel. The gunship stabilized and brought its cannon to bear directly on Barnaby. A stream of heavy munitions walked across the ice and slammed straight into the beast. Even Barnaby's hyperdense scales couldn't stop aircraft rounds. Purple blood erupted into the freezing air like steam. Barnaby let out a roar of absolute agony, his front leg buckling as he collapsed heavily onto the ice. "No!" Skyler shrieked. He tried to stand, but the upload terminal beeped frantically, 82%. 85%. If he uncoupled his suit's battery now, the transmission would fail. Harrison would win, and Barnaby would die for nothing. Skyler stayed pinned to the floor, tears freezing to his cheeks, holding the wires together. The gunship hovered menacingly over the wounded beast, a heavy missile dropping from its belly. The targeting laser painted a solid red dot squarely on Barnaby's chest. "Target locked," the pilot stated coldly. Barnaby, bleeding heavily, looked across the ice at Skyler. His crimson stripes flickered, fading back to a deep, peaceful blue. He let out a low huff that sounded almost like a sigh. Then, the apex predator did the impossible. Ignoring his shattered shoulder and a dozen gunshot wounds, Barnaby dug his hind legs into the permafrost. With a final, earth-shattering roar, he launched his entire 6-ton bulk 30 feet straight up into the air, right into the downwash of the rotors. The pilot barely had time to scream before Barnaby slammed onto the nose of the aircraft. Massive scythe-like claws effortlessly punched through the reinforced cockpit glass. The overwhelming weight of the alien dragged the gunship downward, throwing it completely out of control. The aircraft went into a fatal spin, its rotors catching the edge of the cliff face and shattering into a million pieces. The gunship plummeted out of the sky, slamming into the lower snowbank in a blinding concussive fireball. Barnaby rolled free a fraction of a second before the explosion, sliding across the jagged ice and coming to a heavy, motionless halt 20 feet from the relay doors. Skyler stared in horror. He looked down at the terminal. 100% data burst complete. Encryption verified. Skyler immediately ripped the power cord away, abandoning the drive, and scrambled across the ice on his hands and knees. He reached Barnaby's side. The beast was a mess of burns and cuts, his breathing shallow and ragged. Hey, buddy," Skyler choked out, pulling his helmet off completely. He pressed his bare hands against the beast's thick, cold snout. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." Barnaby didn't open his eyes, but a weak, vibrating hum resonated deep within his chest, answering the human's touch. Suddenly, the proximity radio in Skyler's discarded helmet crackled to life. It carried the absolute authority of the highest echelons of the military. "Cadet Pendleton, this is Fleet Admiral Sterling of the Interstellar Coalition High Command," the voice echoed, cold and uncompromising. "We have received your data packet in full. Your logs have been verified. Commander Harrison and his network are currently being detained by military police. All corporate assets on Gliese 832C are hereby declared hostile. Do not move, son. A detachment of orbital drop shock troopers is entering the atmosphere directly above your coordinates now. Medical support inbound. Hold the line, cadet. You did good." Skyler looked up. Piercing through the bruised, stormy clouds of the midnight zone were dozens of brilliant, burning streaks of light, military drop pods coming down like the wrath of God. Skyler slumped against Barnaby's massive, battered side, wrapping his arms around the thick spikes of the beast's neck. "Help is here, Barnaby," Skyler whispered, closing his eyes as the sonic booms began to shatter the sky above them. "We're going home." The footage from Gliese 832C changed the Interstellar Coalition forever. Cadet Skyler Pendleton didn't just expose a massive corporate conspiracy, he fundamentally rewrote humanity's understanding of alien biology. Today, Skyler is the chief xenobiology liaison for the Coalition, and he never goes anywhere without his 6-ton, fiercely loyal shadow, Barnaby. It turns out the universe doesn't always require a bigger gun to survive. Sometimes, it just requires the courage to reach out a hand, and the absolute insanity to pet the monster in the dark.